All right. Good afternoon. What's going on, everybody? This is Tiffany coming through right here live in effect. Today, I want to get into the topic about Partus Sequitur Ventrem. So I want to just focus on that topic today. And for those who may not know what Partus Sequitur Ventrem is, I will show it to you guys. All right. All right. So right here, this is the topic that we're going to be talking about, what I'm going to be getting into today. I think that it's very prevalent for us to really go more into detail about what is a Partus Sequitur Ventrem and why did it take place and how it took place. Because when we talk about slavery, right, we can talk about how we've been brutalized, beat up, and all that other stuff. But we don't get into the actual nitty-gritty of the laws. We don't get into how Black women were used as breeding animals to breed more slaves. We don't get into how the United States, not United States, how the American law at that time said that if the status of the mother is determined the status of the child. So whatever the mother is, that's what the child is going to become. And the reason why that is because most of the time, children are with their mother more than they are with their fathers. So when you have children that's with their mother so often, right, you go 9 times out of 10, you're going to go wherever your mother goes. So wherever the mother moves, if she moves out of state, the child's going to move out of state with the mom unless something happens to where the mother is not present, someone else comes in. But 9 times out of 10, majority of the time, the child is with their mother. So with that being said, because they know this, they looking at the status of the mom. What's her value? Is her value worth it? And then you also got to realize that if the African woman was able to reproduce, if she was pregnant, or she was still at the childbearing age, the value was more for her than it is for the woman who could not bear children. All right. So let me go ahead and get started. Okay. So as you can see, I'm on the introduction that says Partus Sequitur Ventrem. In the history of slavery, the legal doctrine of Partus Sequitur Ventrem, which is Latin, that which is brought forth follows the belly, was used from 1662 in Virginia and later other English royal colonies to establish the legal status of children born there. They were considered to follow the status of their mothers. Therefore, children of enslaved women were born into slavery. Those born to free white women, even if indentured slave servants, were born free. The legal doctrine of Partus Sequitur Ventrem derived from Roman civil law, which concerned personal properties, chattels. Then it goes on to say, in colonial law, the Partus doctrine was also used to justify enslavement as a chattel personal of the native peoples of Americas, Northern, Central, and Southern, where the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the French colonial empire, and the Dutch Empire established settler colonies to exploit the natural resources of the New World. As the colonial law in British America, the Partus doctrine passed into law in 1662 in the Virginia colony established that children were born into the social status of their mother, unlike in English common law in which the father's status was determinative. Thus, de facto and de jure slave status will apply to every child born to an enslaved woman. Other colonies adopted this principle, and it was applied and enforced through the local laws that regulated slavery in the Northern American colonies. As a function of the political economy of chattel slavery, the legalism of Partus Sequitur Ventrem exempted the biological father from his food and shelter obligation under English common law toward children he fathered with a slave woman. The denial of paternity to slave children secured the slaveholder's right to profit from exploiting the labor of children engendered, bred, and born into slavery. But it also meant that mixed-race children born to white women were born free. Early generations of families of free people of color in the Upper South were formed from unions between working-class white women and African or African-American men. All right. Again, that's determined. The law was created to determine the social status of the child who was born to a mother. So, as I read to you there, if the mother happened to be a Caucasian woman or any other woman besides African descent, right, that child will be born free. But if the child was born to a mother that is African descent, based on her status, if she was a free woman, the child would be born free. If she was enslaved, the child would be born as a slave. That's how they determine the status. Now, some of you might think, oh, that's very crucial. Yes, this was very crucial. That's what slavery was. It was a crucial activity that took place. It wasn't about human rights. It was about economics. It was about property value. That's what it was all about. That was the earliest form of capitalism. Okay? So no, they didn't care about the human value as far as livelihood is concerned, integrity is concerned. All they was caring about is monetary resources and profits. So you got to understand, just like black men were seen as animals, black women were seen as animals. They were seen as animals that was breeding. They was used as a breeding farm to breed more children. Now, check this out here. Okay, I have a book here, and to be honest with you, I have not read it yet, but I am quite sure that this book goes into details, not just about slavery, but also about the Partus Sequitur Ventrem. All right. I don't know. Some of you may have heard this book, some of you may not, but I'm going to put it up. It's called The Half Has Never Been Told. And it talks about slavery and the making of American capitalism by Edward E. Baptist. The Half Has Never Been Told. Okay. So I don't know if you guys ever read this book or ever got this book, but you know, it's highly recommendable only because it goes into more further details about slavery that we may not know about. And I'll be honest with you again, I have not even had the opportunity to really read it, but because it sparked my curiosity, you know, I was curious to know what this book is about. And eventually I am going to read it and I'm going to have some form of discussion about this book. But yeah, this book right here goes into the detail about slavery and capitalism and black women being used as breeding animals and all. All right. So back then, there was no what we call today reproductive rights. There was none of that. Because slave women didn't have that kind of right. They were slaves. They were properties. So the master wasn't trying to hear it. And then not only that, let's go into the story about gynecology, what we call modern day gynecology. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, his practice was very brutal, left many women in excruciating pain, caused many of them to die when he was giving them checkups and not putting them on anesthesias and whatnot. Yeah, but that's another topic, though. That's a very gruesome topic to talk about. But let's go ahead and let's look up some more source. All right. So I have another information I want to present. Okay, and then I'm going to show some video. I'm going to show a video that's going to back this up. So right here, this article here is called "The Belly of the World." All right, so the title is "Soul: A Critical Journal of Black Politics, Culture, and Society." And it was written in 2016, I believe. Yeah, 2000. Yeah, it was written in 2016, not that long ago. It's called "The Bellies of the World: A Note on Black Women's Labor." Saidiya Hartman. All right, so this is volume 18, number 1, January to March 2016, page 166, 173. It says comments from the field. There's the title again. It goes on to say, the slave ship is a womb/abyss. The plantation is the belly of the world. Partus Sequitur Ventrem. Let me highlight that. All right. Let me go back and read that again. The slave ship is a womb/abyss. The plantation is the belly of the world. Partus Sequitur Ventrem. The child follows the belly. The masters of future increase. The modern world follows the belly. Gestational language has been key to describing the world-making and world-breaking capacity of racial slavery. What it created and what it destroyed has been what has been destroyed has been explicated by way of gender features of conception, birth, parturition, and severe or negated maternity. To be a slave is to be excluded from the prerogatives of birth. The mother's only claim to transfer her disposition to the child. The material relation of sexuality and reproduction define Black women's historical experiences as laborers and shape the character of the refusal of or resistance to slavery. The thief, regulation, and destruction of Black women's sexual and reproductive capacity will also define the afterlife of slavery. All right, so now let's go down to here. And it says, most often when the when the productive labor of the slave comes into view, it is a category absent gender and sexual differentiation. And two of the greatest works of the Black radical tradition, W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, and C.L.R. James, Black Jacobins, the agency of the enslaved become legible as politics rather than crime or destruction at the moment slaves are transformed into Black workers in revolutionary masses fashion along the line of the insurgent proletariat. I mispronounced words, so anyways. However, representing the slave through the figure of the worker, albeit unwaged and unfree, obscures as much as it reveals, making it difficult to distinguish the constitutive elements of slavery as a mode of power, violence, dispossession, and accumulation, or to attend to the forms of gendered and sexual violence that enable these processes. In Black Reconstruction, women's sexual and reproductive labor is critical in accounting for the violence and degradation of slavery. Yet this labor falls outside of the heroic account of the Black worker and the general strike. I don't think I have to explain it because the article explains it itself. It says Black women, too, refused the conditions of work on the plantation, and Du Bois notes their presence among the army of fugitives rushing away from the fields. Yet, in the shift from the fugitive to the striking worker, the female slave becomes a minor figure. Neither the potentialities for the future represented by the fugitive nor the test engendered by flight or refusal and furnish for abolition idealistic embrace her labors. Marriage and protection rather than sexual freedom and reproductive justice were the only ways conceived to redress her wrongs or remedy the wound dealt to her reputation as a human being. The sexual violence and reproduction characteristic of enslaved women experience fails to produce a radical politics of liberation or a philosophy of freedom. And then it also goes in and say, Black women's labor have not been easy to reckon with conceptually. Feminist thinkers, following the path cleared by Angela Davis' groundbreaking essay, Reflection of the Black Woman's Role in the Community of Slaves, have considered the significant in gender, sexuality, and reproduction in defining the constitutive relation of slavery and the modes of its violence. It has proven difficult, if not possible, to assimilate Black women's domestic labor and reproductive capacity within narratives of the Black worker, slave rebellion, maroonage, or Black radicalism, even as this labor was critical to the creation of value, the realization of profit, and accumulation of capital. It has been no less complicated to imagine the future produced by labors as anything other than monstrous. Certainly, we know that enslaved women fled the plantation, albeit not in as great numbers as men. Poisoned slaveholders plotted resistance, dreamed of destroying the master and his house, utilizing abortifacient. All right, let's talk about abortifacient. For those who don't know what abortifacient was like some type of herbal medicine, right? Natural remedy that was used to have natural abortion, if you will. So kind of think of it as, I don't want to use that example. But anyways, yeah, it was just like some type of herbal medicines that was used during ancient time period to prevent pregnancy from occurring. So yes, abortifacient's been around for a long time, way before they had these procedures that we have today. where women can go to the clinic and go through the process of terminating their pregnancy, right? Back then, they used herbal medicine and all type of, mix them all up together to prevent pregnancy. That was a form of birth control, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. All right, so I'm going back. Okay, yeah, utilize abortifacient rather than reproductive slaves. Practice infanticide rather than sentences their children to social death. The auction block and the master's bed exercise autonomy in suicidal acts, gave birth to children as testament to an abiding knowledge of freedom contrary to every empirical index of the plantation, and yearn for radically different ways of being in the world. So where exactly does the sex drudge recalcitrant domestic broken mother or sullen wet nurse fit into the scheme of the general strike? If the general strike is a placeholder for political aspiration that Du Bois struggled to name, how does the character of the slave female refusal augment the text of Black radicalism? It is at all possible to imagine her as the paradigmic slave or as the representative Black worker. So basically looking at the work and looking at the past, Black women were not only good for slave working and breeding, but they were also used for pleasure. So if the master wants to just get pleasure, right, and he doesn't want to deal with his wife, he can go and snatch up one of the slaves and bring her in the house. And not only, it was more than one. Let's put it like that, more than one. One master take turn, then another master take turn. And that's where this term bed witch come into play, which I find it very disrespectful how people use it today, because see, you don't understand the pain, the agony that these women had to go through. And a lot of them was forced against their own will to sleep in the bed with somebody that enslaved them, their oppressor. And for you to sit around here calling women bed wenches, that's disrespectful in itself. It shows that you have little to no knowledge about that. This is why people like Tariq Nasheed, for example, I can't really listen to him. Because if you see Black women as nothing more than bed wenches, then it's a problem. It's a problem. You can't sit up here and put out these documentary films, right? And then you turn around calling Black women bed wenches. Oh, you talking about them like as if they had a choice, like it's as if that's what they wanted to be. No, they were forced against their own will. Do you not realize how crucial that shit was? Imagine you being tossed around and you screaming in pain while the slave master run his dick up in your fucking pussy. You can't do shit about it. You can't stop it. You can't take no birth control pills. So if you're pregnant, oh well. There was no rape laws back then. So what was the woman supposed to do then? And then let's make it, and this is the part that really makes it sad. Not only the slave master impregnate his workers, but he'll leave the children with them and don't claim them. How about that? You had some masters that didn't claim their own children. They didn't see their children as theirs, but as the properties of the woman. They didn't see no value in their own kids. So they will get the woman pregnant and they will walk off or vanish. That's why you had so many children that were mulatto or biracial. It's because the mother, the African woman, was raped by the slave master, or the white woman got into a relationship with the African man, which is why most African men at that time, they wanted to get in a relationship with white women. It wasn't just because they hated black women. It was because they didn't want their children to be born into slavery. So they figured the way to do that, because of the law, the Partus Sequitur Ventrem law back then, what else did the man want to do? He said, okay, I don't want my children being born like this. Now, there were those who stuck around with their black women. There were slaves who were married couples. But then there were those who said, nah, I don't want my children being born to this. I want my kids to be free. I want my kids to have a better life. I want them to have a status that I did not have. So that's why so many African men or black men that were free or that was enslaved got into relationship with these white women, because they had this idea thinking that their children wouldn't have to worry about discrimination, or they would have the best quality of education and they wouldn't have to go through the brutality of slavery. That's why. That's why there was those that got involved in interracial marriage or interracial relationship, because of the social politics behind it. All right, so let's see. Let me go ahead and skip on down real quick. All right, check this out. It says on plantation, and I'm going to highlight this. Okay, it says on plantation, black women were required to toil as hard as men and in this way ungendered, according to Spillers, by which she means that female and male adhere to no symbolic integrity. Partus Sequitur Ventrem negate kinship and deny it any legal or social efficacy. The condition of the mother marked her offspring and was forever entailed on her remotest posterity. We carry the mother's mark, and it continues to define our condition and our present. The role of gender and sexual differentiation in the constitution of labor are especially complex in the context of slavery. On one hand, the category of labor insufficiently accounts for slavery as a mode of power, domination, and production. The fungibility of the slave, the wanton uses of the black body for producing value or pleasure, and the shared vulnerabilities of the commodity, whether male or female, trouble dominant accounts of gender. Depending on the angle of vision or critical lexicon, the hardness of the body as an instrument for social and physical reproduction makes the slave as gender subject, or reveals the primacy of gender and sexual differentiation in the making of the slave. Natal alienation is one of the central attributes of the social death of the slave, and gender and sexual violence are central to the process that render the black child as byproduct of the relations of production. At the same time, the line of division between the market and the household, which distinguish the public and the domestic and divide productive productive and reproductive labor for apartheid whites does not hold when describing the enslaved and carousel landscapes of plantation. Reproduction is tethered to the making of human commodities and in service of the marketplace. For the enslaved, reproduction does not ensure any future other than that of dispositions, nor guarantee anything other than the replication of racialized and disposable persons of human increase, expanded property holdings. For the master, the future of the enslaved was a form of speculative value for slaveholders. Even the unborn was conscripted and condemned to slavery. Now, that last part, basically, the child was already determined or predetermined before they were born. The child was already predetermined. So, within American law back then, in slavery law, the child was already determined the status. The moment that the mother became pregnant and she was expected, that's when the status of the child was determined. Now imagine somebody tell you what your status is, what you was going to be before you was born. All right, so let's see. All right, so let me go ahead and share another article. Another source. Okay. All righty. All right. Now let's look at this. All right, there's a part one. This source right here is called The American Slave Coast, a history of slave breeding industry. All right. Which goes into what I was talking about. Okay. And also talks about how Virginia was one of the first colonies to have slavery or be the foundation of slavery. Okay. Virginia, one of the first colonies. All right. Let's see. What can I find here? All right. And this book was written in 2016. So let's go into the table of content. Let's look at part one, the capitalized womb. Mother of slavery, protectionism, or the importance of 1808. A literature of terror, natural increase, little shadows, species of property. All right, let's go ahead and let's look at this. All right. All right, so in this article or this chapter, it talks about how Virginia was considered as the mother of slavery. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this first. I'm going to read this first 3 paragraphs right here. It says, Virginia was the mother of slavery, wrote Lewis Hughes. It wasn't just a figure of speech. During the 53 years from the prohibition of African slave trade by federal law in 1808, the debacle of the Confederate States of America, which was the southern states were considered as the Confederate States of America, while the northern states were considered as United States of America. All right. In 1861, The Southern economy depended on the functioning of a slave breeding industry, of which Virginia was the number one supplier. When Hugh was born in 1832, the market was expanding sharply. My father was a white man. My mother was a negress, meaning that she was a Negro. Hughes wrote, that meant he was classified as a merchandise at birth because children inherit the free or enslaved status of the mother, not the father. It had been that way in Virginia for 170 years already when Hughes was born. Partus Sequitur Ventrem was the legal term. The status of the newborn follows the status of the womb. Fathers passes inheritance down. Mother passed that. Wait a minute. Let me read that part again. Partus Sequitur Ventrem was the legal term. The status of the newborn follows the status of the womb. Fathers passes inheritance down. Mothers pass slavery down. Father passed inheritance down. Mothers pass slavery down. Father passed inheritance down. Mothers pass slavery down. Just a thought. It ensures a steady flow of salable human product from the wombs of women who had no legal rights to say no. All right, and it says, most enslaved African Americans lived and died without writing so much as their names. The Virginia Legal Code of 1849 provides for stripes, flogging for those who try to acquire literacy skills. A free person who dare assemble with Negroes for the purpose of instructing them to read or write could receive jail sentences of up to 6 months and a fine of up to $100 plus costs. An enslaved person who tried to teach others to read might have part of a finger chopped off by the slave owner with the full blessing of law. So it was an especially distinguished achievement when in 1897, 64-year-old Lewis Hughes published his memoir titled 30 Years a Slave from Bondage to Freedom, the institution of slavery as seen on the plantation and in the home of the planter. Like the other volumes, collectively referred to as slave narratives, it bears witness to a history slave owners did not want to exist. The first-hand testimony of the enslaved. By the time Hughes was 12, he had been sold 5 times. The third time he was sold away from his mother to a trader. It was sad to her to part with me, he recalled, though she did not know that she was never to see me again, for my master had said nothing to her regarding his purpose, and she only thought as I did, that I was hired to work on the canal boat and that she would see me occasionally, but at last we never met again. Now, with that being the case, not only see children that always stick with their parents, especially with their mothers. Sometimes when they had the slave auction, right, and one slave master said, okay, and the other slave master wanted to buy up these individuals, what they'll do, they'll split it down. All right, this child's gonna go with you, that child's gonna go with this person right here. And that person's gonna belong to that individual. So guess what? They never got a chance to see their family again. So just because a woman gave birth, and let's just say, yeah, the status of the child is a slave, but that child's not gonna always be guaranteed to be in her household. She's not gonna get that opportunity to raise that child. Not all the time. So for those of you Negroes out there, especially for those of you ADOS people, because y'all do this a lot. You better go back and read a story about slavery, because you had family that was separated. So you may be surprised to find out that you got cousins somewhere in the Caribbeans, or your great auntie or somebody like that in the Caribbeans or in Latin America, because families were separated. I'm just saying. Everybody didn't reunite. You know what? Let me talk about this real quick. There was this silly ass discussion that I had on Facebook, and I say silly because it was ridiculous. It was stupid. So this guy was on my page, and there was a little meme post about if women have the right to their reproduction and have a right to abort children, things of that nature, should men also have the right to not want to have anything to do with a child? Meaning that, like, should they have the right to not take care of the child or whatnot? And I thought it was ludicrous. And let me tell you why I said it was ludicrous. I thought it was ludicrous because why would you compare a man not wanting to have anything to do with his child to a woman going and getting an abortion? And then the guy put on there, well, you know, the father can always come back and reunite with the child. Not always. That's not always the case. And let's just say you do, but guess what? It's not going to always come out to be a better outcome. Because the moment that you walked out on your child, you just decided you didn't want to have nothing to do with him or her. So when you try to come back and reunite with them, it's not going to be the same. They're not going to look at you the same way. They're not going to respect you as their parents. They're not going to acknowledge you. And that's what people got to understand. And I don't agree with the concept of abortion either, unless it's an emergency case where the woman was raped, where the woman has medical issues, or where someone in the family impregnates her. That's when abortion should be permissible in those three cases. But outside that, I don't agree with the concept of abortion. But the thing is, don't try to compare a father who walks out on his kid, right, and leave the mother to be the only parent to a woman having an abortion. That's just ludicrous to me. It's just ludicrous. And you don't think that for a second, just because you can walk out on your kids, that you can come back at any time, then everything's supposed to be peaches and cream and everybody's supposed to reunite with each other. No, you walked out. You said you didn't want to have nothing to do with that child. You was done. That's the part that people don't understand. You know what I'm saying? So when you make these a conscious decision, right, to engage with one another and have sex, the outcome gonna be that there's a chance that you're gonna produce a child into this world. And if you're not preparing for that, then you need to be more responsible, be more wise. Think before you just lay up with somebody. You know, people have children and they don't want to have anything to do with them. I know I'm kind of off subject, but I just thought that I could bring this in because it happened to come across my mind. But yeah, you know, you can't just, in this case with slavery, these women didn't have no choice, okay? They were forced against their own will. But I'm talking about the ones that's out here today that's just randomly having sex with individuals. It comes with that territory. And you got to prepare for whatever comes your way. If you're not prepared, then you might want to think twice before you open up your legs to any one of these goofy ass motherfuckers out here. Or to anybody, period. You may want to think twice before you put your dick up in some goofy ass hole. Or anybody out here, period. So you got to think, and that's the part we don't think before we act upon doing things. But let's just go. Let me go ahead and go back to the source. Yeah. All right. So the American Slave Coast. That's the name of the book. And you want to look it up, you can go ahead. You can find it on PDF. You can go on Amazon and get this book if you need it. You can go to your local bookstore, go to Barnes & Nobles. I'm quite sure they have it at Barnes & Nobles. Just look up the book. And it was written by Ned and Constance Sublette. All right. Thank you. Peace to the chat. All right, so now I'm going to go back and show another article that I posted up yesterday, or the video that I did the other day. But I'm posting this up for a reason, because it relates a lot to this topic. This book right here is called The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. Okay, now let's go back to the preconception, women, and future increase. All right, now go down to here. It says Partus Sequitur Ventrem, the 1662 Virginia legislation that defined slavery based on the condition of the mother, guaranteed enslavement for enslaved women progeny in all American colonies. Speaking in front of the Virginia legislature in January of 1831, Mr. Golson stated Partus Sequitur Ventrem is coeval with the existence of the right of property itself and is founded in wisdom and justice. He opposed statements made by Mr. Clay, who was not entirely comfortable with the notion of breeding for sale. In Golson's estimation, planters were justified in doing so because women missed work to care for their young, and the value of the property justified the expenses. Adamantly, he continued, I do not hesitate to say that in its increase consists much of our wealth. Women were valued for their fecundity, and traders made projection based on their future increase. Their appraisals were linked to their ability to reproduce. All right. So let's skip down a little bit. All right, so it says, the last 4 decades of 18th century was crucial years for assessing enslaved women's monetary values, and they set the tone for the years that followed. Black women in early America filled the pages of northern and southern newspaper, and slave sale ads became the subject of legal proceeding, in ownership disputes served as collateral for loans among debtors and creditors, and commanded strong prices in an evolving domestic market for sound human property. Their monetary value was based on their age, skills, and reproductive status. Some enslavers rejected childbearing women. Others preferred them. Why did they prefer them? Because they were the commodities. It was worth more for a woman who bare children, or who was expecting children or child, than the woman who was not expecting and the woman who could not bear it. Okay. And physical attractiveness remained the primary factors in their inspection, valuation, and sales. But the choice to buy a childbearing, expecting, or current mother depended on the individual buyer's need and desires. That choice also meant that the potential buyers put a price tag on enslaved children before conception. Again, your status was already predetermined before you was even born. Who determined the cost of an unborn child? What is the physical value of an enslaved people at preconception, and how were childbearing women priced? The answer to these inquiries are linked to mother's uterus because the institution of slavery in the United States extended its reach into women's body. Enslaved women entered the market as objects and producer of goods, yet they appeared as assets and as liability depending on the perspective of the seller or the needs of a potential buyer. So when H.G. Hall stated, "For sale, a young Negro woman," to advertise an unnamed woman and her two children, he was not doing anything unusual. This woman was a complete washer and good ironer, but Hall did not want a breeding wench. Therefore, he placed the family up for sale. There was no mention of the father nor any indication of the woman's age except young. The record only reveals her status as a breeding wench with young children in her care. Despite labor skills, her ability to procreate ultimately led to her sale. On the eve of American Revolution in the early 19th century, many American-born enslaved women shared this experience. They were sold because they gave birth and had young children to nurture. Because procreation and healthy children increased their monetary value, sellers like Hall capitalized by putting enslaved women and their children up for sale. The women's reproductive value were crucial to the expansion of the institution, particularly when the African supply source via transatlantic slave trading was abolished in 1808. This shifted the source to natural coherence, encouraged and forced reproduction of enslaved women in America and other New World slave society. When the French and Spanish occupied Louisiana 18th century, enslavers had relied on captives directly imported from the Caribbean and West African countries. When the French and Spanish occupied Louisiana 18th century, enslavers had relied on captives directly imported from Caribbean and West African countries. Georgia did the same, despite initially having a ban on slavery for nearly the first 2 decades of settlement. The ban was lifted in 1751. Across the South, slavery increased rapidly along with technological developments like the 1793 invention of the cotton gin. Responding to these impetuses, planters moved their enslaved people to the Southwest, enticed by lands included in the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. As a result, Louisiana became the slave trading center of the Deep South in the 19th century. And shall I go on? Changes in the international slave trade and market innovation affected the domestic traffic in human beings, giving the markup for childbearing women. Given a markup for the childbearing women, it appears that the acquisition of land and technological invention altered the face of slavery at the turn of the century. Women played an important role as the shift to import more enslaved women assured enslavers that they could produce additional labor sources on their farm and plantation. They did not have to depend on the market to purchase human property. Instead, by making calculated choices about their enslaved population, they could in fact grow their own. Enslaved women's bodies were catalysts of 19th century economic development, distinguishing U.S. slavery from bondage in other parts of the world. All right. Now, you get the point, right? You get this. So, again, you can read on your own. Read this book about slavery and Partus Sequitur Ventrem. All right, this book goes into that detail. As you can see, I read some of it. The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, written by Diana Ramey Berry. Okay, and this book was written in what year? What year did this book come out? I believe this book came out in 2010. I want to say. I think it came out in 2010. I'm not sure. But I'm not sure what year this book came about, but it still have valuable information. So look this up for yourself. All right. Um, so I'm gonna play a video, short video, real quick. Okay. I'm going to play a short video that's going to kind of like, okay, you said 2017. Okay, I knew it was somewhere around that time period. Yeah, so it ain't been that long ago. All right, so I'm going to play a video by Jennifer Morgan, and she goes into the topic about law and reproduction for enslaved women and the Partus Sequitur Ventrem. All right, so as you can see. All right, then, hold on. I didn't do something right here. All right, there we go, audio. Okay, so I'm going to put myself on mute and I'm going to let this video play.
Slave traders, early English slave owners, and colonial legislators all offered clumsy and piecemeal articulations of New World labor practices, but the terms of racial slavery rested emphatically on women's bodies. Whether it was to clarify that the baptism of children did not convey freedom, to regulate the intimacies that were at the heart of interracial sex, or to ascertain that enslaved women's babies were always already enslaved, reproducing women posed problems and offered solutions for English Atlantic settlers concerned with what it meant to be enslaved and free in the early modern Atlantic. So both in its mobilization of heritability and its articulation of a severed tie to one's natal home, Orlando Patterson's concept of social death and the idea of natal alienation is a recognition that racial slavery required an appropriation of reproductive logic. However, Patterson's concept doesn't really get at the race reproduction bind that is at its heart. And neither he nor most of the scholars, I would argue, who have deployed Patterson in his wake situate enslaved mothers either as historical subjects or as symbols of slavery's heritability. And I'm using this phrase, the race reproduction bind, which I borrowed from Elise Weinbaum, who writes on the 20th century and who I think really has a very helpful exploration of the connection between the two. The failure to move beyond a kind of symbolic register of natal alienation, I think, renders enslaved women's responses to the violent dispossession at the heart of the concept unexamined, and it leaves significant gaps in our understanding of how and why race came to function as it did. In other words, I think that we need to think about what we mean when we say that enslavement means natal alienation, and to think about what that means for the women whose experience of natality, let's say, are at the heart of the concept. And I don't think that we have done that adequately. One of the places that scholars turn to frequently to talk about the process that unfolds in English Atlantic slavery is colonial Virginia. And they do so because colonial Virginia has this very, very slow and incremental engagement with slave labor. It starts out with a very small number of enslaved people, a real commitment to indentured servitude as a labor system, and only gradually over the course of the 17th century shifts from being this place where there are enslaved people from the very beginning, from 1619 and before, to a place that really relies in Ira Berlin's phrase, to a place that is a slave society rather than a society with slaves. So there's an emphasis, I think, on this kind of processual, the sort of slow way that slavery comes to happen in the Chesapeake. And one of the things that's emphasized there is an idea of racial fluidity. That because there are free blacks and enslaved people who end up being free, who are sometimes servants, who are sometimes enslaved, who may become property owners, who may become slave owners themselves. There's also this sense that colonial Virginia offers us this place where we might see something else evolve, right? That racial slavery is not destiny there. I'm not sure that that's the way to look at this, and that's what you're going to see as I talk further. So drawing from Lisa Lowe, I argue here that what we need to do to understand the race reproduction bind, to think carefully about what Partus Sequitur Ventrem actually does, is to, that what we need is histories of intimacy. And that through histories of intimacy, we'll be able to highlight, among other things, the kind of originary logic of the race reproduction bind. Historical studies that center the apparatus of intimacy in colonial regimes, and by that I mean more 19th century, 20th century colonial regimes, have made important inroads. But I think that historians who work on the history of the early modern Atlantic world have not done so much to think about intimacy as a regime. With few exceptions, I would argue birth and sexuality remain underexamined components in the early modern history of racial formation in the Black Atlantic world. And there are some exceptions, including the forthcoming work by Professor Sasha Turner, who's sitting here in front of me. So when colonial Virginia legislators passed this act to clarify the hereditary nature of racial slavery, they explicated the connection the connection between birth and race. The language of reproduction formed a crucial piece of the ideological apparatus that was brought to bear on status, freedom, and Christianity in the Virginia settlement and the early modern Black Atlantic. This 1662 intervention is a reassurance to slave-owning settlers. It's a way to help slave owners map the new meanings of status that are being produced on colonial bodies. So what this legal intervention does is it reassures settlers that in the matter of enslaved people, enslavability passes down through the mother, Partus Sequitur Ventrem, or literally offspring follows belly. While the original text of the law does not include this Latin phrase in there, it's added by later reproductions of the law. What the wording of Partus Sequitur Ventrem does is it evokes legal precedent that's rooted in the language of livestock rather than in bastardy. So the point being that through the bastardy laws, you could have dealt with the problem of children who were fathered by men who were not married to those children's mothers. But rather than evoke the bastardy law and saying that the children of African women are bastards, are illegitimate, they evoke this idea of livestock and lineage. Bastardy laws would have clarified the status of a child born of a non-married couple, but by echoing the language of property, the legislators weighed in on something larger than sexual mores, right? Following on the ruminations of 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas, which I can talk about later, the Virginia legislators responded to the question of slavery and descent with an answer that was rooted in women's bodies. The bastardy laws would be insufficient as a solve for their concerns. The issue on the table, of course, was not status, but rather property. So the history of slavery is, in its broadest possible terms, a history of alienation from lineage and from kin. It's one in which the material or experiential phenomenon around reproduction and maternity unfortunately fade from view. Connections, though, between slavery, freedom, gender, and reproduction are long-standing. The word freedom, for example, can be traced to an ancient language in which the word amargi, which is the origin.
All right, so that was the video that went into the detail. Have you noticed when she said that sometimes as blacks, they were sometimes free, sometimes they had to work as slaves, and sometimes some of them owned slaves. Yes, some blacks did own slaves, but again, that's another topic for another day. But I just wanted to give you the outline of the video that's dealing with this very subject matter, because again, this is the piece of subject that really reveal all of the contents, right, of how slavery came into picture, how the generation continued after. So if we don't look at this law, this Partus Sequitur Ventrem, if we don't look at this, then you really can't talk about the subject of slavery without actually looking into that, because that plays the factor, the major factor into slavery and capitalism. Not just lineage, but humanist. Exactly. Yes. Exactly. All right. So that's all for today. Thank you for those who are watching. And if you want to share this video, you're more than welcome to do so. If you want to subscribe to the channel, please do so. And thank you for those of you who have subscribed to my channel. I really appreciate that. That really means a lot. But make sure you share and hit the notification bell whenever I come on. All right. With that being said, may peace and power elevation be to you all. Until next time, deuces, and I'll reconnect with you guys later. All right. Thank you.